Once upon a time, the Russian military was widely considered the second most powerful on Earth. Today, it isn't even the most powerful military in Ukraine. Since the full-scale invasion in 2022, Russia's armed forces have endured a strange ritual of humiliation, partly due to the cunning and innovation of their Ukrainian rivals, but also significantly due to the sheer bumbling idiocy of their own commanding officers. Make no mistake, Ukraine would never have held out this long without the bravery and tenacity of its armed forces. Yet, Russia's consistent ability to stumble into new and catastrophic blunders certainly hasn't hurt Ukraine's cause. As painful as the last few years have been for the Russian military, the situation has deteriorated even further in 2026. Russia is losing troops at an unprecedented rate, expending more lives, more munitions, and more state wealth, even as they capture less and less territory each month. Their battlefield commanders are making increasingly poor decisions, and they openly lie to their superiors when attacks inevitably fail. In the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin and his inner circle are fed a constant stream of false victories, while on the front lines, Russia's spring and summer offensive has fallen flat on its face. But however incompetent the Russian military might seem, the reality is even worse. Because underneath Ukrainian victories and Moscow's obvious blunders, the Russian military has built a hidden, corrupt machine where every battlefield catastrophe puts rubles into Russian pockets. Before we delve into the myriad problems, it's important to acknowledge a caveat about the Russian armed forces. Despite the beating Moscow has taken in Ukraine, and despite all the issues we are about to discuss, we are not claiming the Russian military is merely a stiff breeze away from total collapse. As of the time of writing, Russian forward progress on the battlefield has largely halted overall. However, Russia is still pushing forward in some areas even as it is pushed back in others. In fact, we want to draw your attention to the opposite point. Even after all that Ukraine has accomplished in this war, and after all the potential Moscow has squandered, the Russian military still stands. At times seemingly in spite of itself, but it stands nonetheless. We highlight this partly to maintain realistic expectations for this discussion, and also this is crucial whenever our conversation turns to corruption. The graft and exploitation we will describe today are not accidental. They exist because of the war in Ukraine. They feed off the war in Ukraine, and the people who benefit most from this exploitation are the same people with the greatest incentives to ensure the war continues, even when any honest outside appraisal would suggest that Russian gains are nowhere near worth the cost. Let's begin this tour de force of Russian incompetence with the problems inflicted upon Moscow by its enemies in Kyiv, starting with Russia's spring and summer offensive. Just a few short months ago, Russia was moving its assets into position for what was intended to be a major push centered on the city of Sloviansk in the partially occupied Donetsk Oblast. Taking Sloviansk would not have been easy for the Russians. To get there, they would first have had to capture the city of Lyman in an intense urban battle, similar to what occurred in Bakhmut from 2024 until early this year. Then to capture Sloviansk, they would have had to win an even bigger urban battle while simultaneously diverting Ukraine's attention elsewhere by pressing a series of secondary offensives. Capturing Sloviansk would have meant seizing the northern anchor point of Ukraine's vaunted fortress belts, a multi-layered structure of defensive fortifications that Ukraine absolutely must hold against Russian capture. However, even before the spring offensive could properly get underway, Ukraine revealed what has turned out to be a decisive advantage: a new arsenal of mid-range drones, including an American-made model called the Hornet, coupled with tactical advancements to use these drones effectively. Dubbed the Martian II by Russian soldiers, the Hornet is piloted partially by artificial intelligence and is completely impervious to Russian jamming because it navigates by visually reading the terrain using AI rather than relying on GPS or remote control. The onboard AI can identify targets and even handle the final kill process autonomously. Flying at a range of over 100 kilometers, these drones are practically silent until just before impact. They are extremely cheap, and Ukraine has used them less to target Russian troops at the front, and more to target the staging operations that would have formed the foundation of a successful offensive. Russian forces have been unable to protect their ammunition stockpiles, fuel trucks, encampments, and training grounds away from the front lines. Nor is the Hornet the only drone in Ukraine's arsenal. Recently, Ukraine's 412th Nemesis Brigade unveiled the Morgan, another mid-range strike drone optimized to operate significantly behind enemy lines. These drones have allowed Ukraine to completely defuse the spring offensive before it ever truly gained momentum. Even more importantly, Ukraine has achieved these results without putting its soldiers at greater risk. Ukraine's forces are chronically undermanned and perpetually exhausted, and Kyiv does not have the ability to go head-to-head with the full strength of a Russian offensive in any one area. Instead, it has completely destroyed the infrastructure Russia needed to create an offensive that wouldn't collapse under its own weight. As a result, Russian forces near the front are badly isolated, cut off from easy reinforcement and resupply, while the bulk of the killing takes place away from the front lines, where Russian troops naturally have their guard down. Ukraine has even expanded its strikes to target the highway network leading across occupied territory and into Crimea, where the impact of Ukraine's bombardment has become so severe that the entire region is on the brink of economic collapse. Fuel trucks, trains, and even ferries are unable to reach Crimea. The existing fuel storage infrastructure there has been destroyed, and the problems are only worsening, with fuel shortages now starting to spread across the Donbas. According to the latest frontline reports, mobile drone defense teams are now at risk of running out of fuel, a crisis that would clear the way for even deeper Ukrainian strikes. Better yet for Ukraine, targeting efficiency is constantly improving to the point that it now takes only a few minutes for Ukrainian forces to spot a new moving target, get a drone on site, and destroy it. However, we must emphasize that Ukraine's new drone designs and tactics have been so successful because of Russia's inability to cope. Over the last several years, Russia and Ukraine have been engaged in a cycle of mutual innovation, with one side developing new solutions to battlefield problems and gaining a temporary advantage until the other side counters with innovations of their own. This time, however, Russia has been unable to innovate a solution to the new problems Ukraine has posed. Kyiv's AI-enabled drones can be shot down using directed energy weapons, dedicated interceptor drones, or conventional firearms operated by an overwhelming mass of patrol troops. But Russia has not been able to develop directed energy weapons, nor is it distributing appropriate interceptor drones to the front. Instead of keeping enough troops in the back lines to protect its own staging areas, Moscow failed to anticipate that a problem of this kind could arise. Now Russian troops are overextended, and they have no choice but to hold their positions on the front, when in reality their manpower is needed to defend the territory Russia has already captured. A similar problem has been playing out across two areas of immense and constant Russian vulnerability, in the air and at sea. In the air, Russia still hasn't found a way to meaningfully engage its air force in the conflict. Besides the use of strategic bombers and MiG-31 fighters to launch long-range cruise missiles, Russia cannot risk using some of its most valuable reconnaissance and command aircraft after Ukraine proved capable of using American-made Patriot missiles to bring them down. And the supposedly world-class U-57 fighter jet is still almost completely absent from contested airspace. Russia's aerial problem is expected to get even worse by early 2027, when Ukraine will take possession of its first Swedish-made Gripen fighter jets, along with a long-range missile, the Meteor, that will have the range to strike Russian strategic bombers as they conduct those missile launches. On the water, Ukraine doesn't have any meaningful naval forces in a conventional sense. But Ukraine's use of sea drones has been so effective that Russia's Black Sea Fleet cannot risk leaving harbor. Nor is the Black Sea Fleet the only Russian naval asset that has been suffering. In a recent series of strikes on the city of St. Petersburg, timed to conclude with a high-profile summit that Vladimir Putin attended personally, Ukraine managed to strike the Boyki, a guided missile corvette that was being repaired in dry dock. Ukrainian mid-range aerial drones have also extended the fight at sea to the extent that they can now carry out precision strikes against naval vessels that were previously vulnerable only to sea drones. Speaks of St. Petersburg, Russian air defenses on the home front appear to be on the verge of complete collapse. Ukrainian long-range drones now regularly impact targets that were once unthinkable, from the Baltic Sea oil terminals at Primorsk and Luga, to sensitive or highly specialized defense industrial centers located deep in the Russian heartland. Sofno has been targeted successfully, and according to the chief designer at Ukraine's leading missile innovator, Firepoint, a new line of ballistic missiles will soon be operational and capable of hitting Moscow directly. Of course, Russia is generally not very open about its air defense failures with the rest of the world, so it's hard to determine conclusively whether its failures are due to a lack of interceptors, Ukrainian oversaturation tactics, a shortage of systems overall, a technical deficiency that prevents Russia from recognizing incoming drones, or some combination of those factors. What we do know, however, is that Russia hasn't been able to meaningfully address the problem. In fact, the problem is now so bad that Russia recently passed legislation allowing businesses and banks to purchase and operate their own air defenses. That means Russia is basically enlisting untrained civilian security personnel to try and cover the gaps. It's also enlisting the power of the financial sector to purchase and operate anti-drone systems that Russia can't or doesn't want to pay for. As for its attempts to prevent Ukrainian long-range strikes, Russia seems unable to hit the command and control centers or the drone stockpiles that enable the campaign. So instead, Russia tries to deter Ukraine by launching long-range strikes of its own, often targeting population centers, energy infrastructure, or dual-use facilities, instead of going after the Ukrainian military. That deterrent, however, is basically ineffective, and Ukraine has proved entirely willing to absorb the pain of those strikes, if it means they'll be able to hit Russia back. As impressive as Ukraine's recent advancements have been, they still only tell part of the story. Just as important, if not more so, is the incredible consistency with which Russia manages to shoot itself in the foot. Moscow's original sin, so to speak, is one that the rest of the world has grown very familiar with. A supreme overconfidence that has been helping Russia defeat itself from the very beginning. Despite the alternative storylines pushed out by Russian bot farms and repeated no doubt in comment sections across the internet, the idea that Kyiv would fall in 3 days was very much a Russian invention. It was cited in Western documents, based on leaked FSB reports, and later confirmed when Ukrainian forces found only 3 days' worth of provisions in Russian vehicles abandoned during their failed early advance. But much more important than Russia's initial mistake is the fact that Moscow still hasn't learned its lesson. Military planners and strategists throughout the Russian military, from unit level on the battlefield to Vladimir Putin himself, still base their decisions and expectations on an aggrandized version of the military that simply does not exist. Over time, that problem has fused with another. The fact that Russian leaders, again from the unit level all the way to the top, simply refuse to give each other honest assessments of what's happening. At a certain point, those leaders realized they could get away with reporting advances, victories, and other good news that didn't actually exist. The problem often starts small on the front lines. A Russian army captain sends it to small to and take a few selfies in a contested area before that unit is annihilated in drone strikes. The captain then sends those selfies to his major, claiming that his forces took the territory in the picture. That same day, the major receives several similar reports from other captains. So he reports to his colonel that the front line has moved up by a few hundred meters, when in reality most of the forces under his command have not moved at all. That's a hypothetical example, of course, but you get the idea. And that news then travels up the chain until it reaches somebody like the chief of the general staff of the Russian armed forces, Valery Gerasimov. We highlight Gerasimov in particular because this is how you get statements like the one he made this past April, when he claimed that Russia had captured a total of 80 settlements and over 1,700 square kilometers since the start of the year. According to independent war monitors, Gerasimov tripled the amount of territory Russia had actually taken, and of course, he failed to account for the territory Russia had lost. Don't just take it from us, though. Even Russia's mill blogger class was calling out the deception in the aftermath. These institutional miscommunications, combined with the Russian military's inflated perception of itself, have combined to form a third problem, a demand for forward progress at all costs. At this point in the war, commanders and higher-ups have grown very accustomed to the idea that their troops are consistently moving forward, consistently taking territory, and consistently getting Russia closer to victory. But now that lie has become too big to fail. If individual Russian commanders were to report results that don't align with that lie in places Russia wasn't expecting, then they are at risk of being demoted, relieved of duty, or even worse. As a result, each level of Russian leadership places immense pressure on the next level below them, all the way down to the frontline soldiers, because their commanders need to deliver forward progress, and because their commanders won't get into any real trouble if they sacrifice more lives. In exchange, those frontline troops are at immense risk of being ordered forward into incredibly risky assaults. Of course, it's not unusual for a soldier on the front line of a major war to face some risk. But there's a difference between being asked to advance as part of a coordinated push on a well-defined, well-scouted target, and being told to sneak into a zone where there's been no prior scouting and where Ukrainians' surveillance and kamikaze drone coverage is expected to be overwhelming. These are the kinds of situations Russian soldiers are being ordered into, not because there's any expectation that they would succeed, but because their attempt gives their commanders enough plausible deniability to report success. Eventually, this tactic does sometimes work. Enough Russian soldiers survive in little hiding spots after enough small unit advances that they reach a point of local saturation on territory they can then take over. But the costs in munitions, funds, supplies, and especially human life are so much greater than the value of what Russia is actually capturing. Nor does Russia particularly care which soldiers get sent to the meat grinder. More and more sources from within the Russian military report that troops are sent into assault units regardless of their other qualifications, including skilled recruits who could make meaningful contributions to enhance Russia's overall situation. Soldiers with experience in electrical work, logistics management, and even the medical field have been reassigned against their will to Saltholz brigades, often without explanation. At times, those reassigned come after they were recruited into the military on the promise that they'd be working with their advanced skill set. Sometimes the reassigned appear to be random, but at other times they're used as punishment. Soldiers who disobey orders, try to desert, or otherwise anger their commanders are highly likely to be reassigned to units where they'll be used as cannon fodder. Let's circle back to Ukraine's mid-range drone campaign, because that makes this problem even worse. At the best of times, Russian troops were being sent forward into these high-risk assaults with at least a few things going for them. A little bit of training and prep time, a decently well-supplied sustainment infrastructure to keep them alive, a possibility of medevac if they were wounded, and a possibility that reinforcements would soon join them if they survived. Today, though, that entire support infrastructure has been torn to shreds, yet the expectation of forward progress still remains. So, these soldiers are still ordered forward, but they're overexposed, undersupplied, and isolated compared to what was already a bad situation. When they're wounded, they aren't evacuated. They die slow, horrific, predictable deaths, to the point that instead of the usual ratio of killed to wounded in modern war, 1 killed for every 3 wounded, Ukrainian assessments suggest that Russia's balance looks more like 2 soldiers killed for every 1 wounded. Even worse, the soldiers who are wounded will often be sent back to combat. Every so often, video footage emerges from the front lines depicting soldiers on crutches or in wheelchairs, bearing visible shrapnel wounds or dealing with limbs that won't work as they're supposed to, forced back into assault units where their death is all but certain. And all of that would be bad enough if Russia wasn't so insistent on hobbling its soldiers even further. Take the example of frontline drone equipment. According to Russian Milblogger sources, the Kremlin's recently ordered most combat units to start giving up drones of various models, sending them back to be reassigned to Russia's dedicated drone forces. That's despite the fact that the Russian drone forces are not properly dispersed along the front line, and they're not part of any efficient decision-making infrastructure that would allow them to support Russian troops in real time. So where a Russian platoon might once have been able to use small FPV drones to scout their surroundings or strike Ukrainian targets, they now have nothing. They're operationally blind and beholden to another branch of the military for support. On paper, Russia has started to fix the issue. Officials in Moscow say that Russia is now producing record numbers of FPV drones. According to the Milbloggers, however, these replacement drones are unreliable, ineffective, and of dangerously low construction quality. Similarly, Russian troops are still reeling from the decision to cut off access to Telegram a couple of months ago, demanding that Telegram be replaced with a state-run Max app, despite the fact that it is insecure, incomplete, and extremely buggy. The same could be said for the loss of Starlink, a Western-controlled connectivity service that Russia chose to remain dependent on instead of dedicating the appropriate resources to build its own alternative. Now, if we were to end this episode right now, the situation we've described would already be bad enough. A Russian military that has completely failed to address Ukrainian combat innovations, and one that has consistently made decisions that put its troops at extreme unnecessary risk. But all too often, when a country or a fighting force seems to suffer from issues so comprehensive and so obviously stupid that they seem to resist understanding, it's important to ask another question: who's getting paid? If Russia's obvious incentives are to increase the combat potency of its troops, make legitimate gains on the battlefield, and eventually win the war, then who benefits inside Russia from making sure that doesn't happen? To answer that question, we're going to invite you to think about the war a bit differently for just a minute. Take away the people, the guns, the tanks, the drones, and the territory, and think about Russia's invasion as a flow of money. That money is being sent from within Russia and funneled into Ukraine, sent in the form of military equipment, fuel supplies, and direct payments made to Russian soldiers. Then some of that money flows back into Russia as those soldiers' paychecks travel to bank accounts or are sent to their families. That flow of funds is partially regulated, but it's happening in and around an active combat zone, which means monitoring is difficult. And financial transfers have to happen with limited internal oversight or anti-corruption protections. Not to mention that the Russian state isn't exactly the best at internal oversight. Transactions happen on the aggregate scale of tens of billions of rubles, meaning that even relatively large amounts of missing cash can easily be dismissed as just a rounding error. So, if you were a person interested in taking money that you could reasonably obtain somewhere within the Russian economy, then the war is the perfect place to do it. You've just got to figure out where you can get in the way of the regular flow of funds, whether those funds are headed into the conflict zone or traveling out. Take another look at the problems the Russian military is dealing with, and the specter of internal corruption is everywhere. We'll start with a few examples at the top, from people who exert immense power within the Russian armed forces. Take Roman Dimiev, a major general who serves as deputy commander of Russia's 20th Combined Arms Army. Over the span of several years, he engaged in regular shakedowns of his subordinates worth the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of US dollars, some of which he passed up to his superiors who expected additional payouts. As he once texted to one of his subordinates, "War is war, but don't forget about the cash. Get yours. Delete this message later." Or take the former Deputy Defense Minister Ruslan Salykov, who was brought up on bribery, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that alleged he created a gang to steal from the Russian state budget. He was brought down during a wave of prosecutions that surrounded former Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. But even though Russia does occasionally prosecute corrupt officials, the Kremlin's track record dovetails in a very troubling way with the problem we've already mentioned. Commanders only tend to come under real scrutiny when they've already failed in some way that requires their removal, usually due to battlefield setbacks. From Vladimir Putin's perspective, the nice thing about everybody in the Russian leadership being so corrupt is that when it's time to remove them, it usually doesn't take very long to dig into their finances and bring legitimate, damning charges against them. But if these commanders understand that they'll only be scrutinized after they've been found to have committed battlefield screw-ups, then they're heavily incentivized to ensure that their screw-ups don't become common knowledge. So they push their subordinates harder, and they push their subordinates harder still, until frontline soldiers are fighting and dying to create an illusion of frontline progress, so their commanders can save their skins. Or take another problem we've already mentioned: the cheap and ineffective FPV drones that are being flooded toward the Russian front lines. That decision was the work of Yuri Vaganov, the commander of the Russian Unmanned Systems Forces, who was appointed in late 2025. But here's the thing about Vaganov. He has zero military experience, zero military education, despite now holding the rank of lieutenant colonel. Instead, he owns a very large drone company, the same drone company that's now guzzling down rubles from state contracts and mass-producing the FPV drones that Russian soldiers are expected to use. Interesting, isn't it? In essence, this single aspiring oligarch has worked out a way to position himself within both the Russian military itself and the Russian defense industrial complex so that he could give himself a monopoly over drone procurement in the biggest drone war the world has ever seen. For Russian soldiers, his appointment is a life-threatening catastrophe. But for Vaganov himself, the incentives will be to cut corners, inflate costs, and otherwise pillage as much of Russia's droned budget as possible. But let's talk about the other way that money flows through the Russian side of this war, into soldiers' pockets, and then ideally back to their bank accounts or to their families. That's where lower-level commanders get their opportunity, because they wield the power to decide who lives and who dies. Take an article published this April by The Economist, where a dozen Russian contract soldiers describe a system where low-level infantrymen will bribe their commanders for a position away from the front and then spend a high share of their remaining wages financing their commander's lifestyle, while carrying out unpaid labor on the side. As one soldier in that article described, troops often start giving up a portion of their paychecks to buy decent drones or body armor or other assets that might, keep them alive. But then also, as he stated, you'll pay forever so they don't send you to the meat grinder. Other Russian commanders have purportedly forced troops to pay exorbitant sums to stay alive, and sometimes just to avoid being shot on the spot. According to recent reports by exiled Russian journalists, low-level commanders operate more like gang leaders than actual military personnel in increasingly sophisticated structures that are informed by the high proportion of ex-convicts that now swell the Russian ranks. Often when new troops arrive, commanders confiscate their bank cards and PIN codes and threaten violence against those who don't comply. And when those soldiers are killed, they're formally reported by their commanders as missing, a change that ensures that money will continue flowing to their accounts. Think of frontline soldiers as a pure revenue stream, and even some of Russia's most asinine decisions start to make sense. When a soldier is wounded in combat, that soldier still receives a paycheck, and if they can be kept on the front lines, then the process of extortion can continue. When a higher-skilled Russian recruit shows up in one of those units, commanders know that they're likely to have more money, partly because they're going to be paid on a better contract, and partly because they probably have some form of savings squirreled away from their civilian life. Trap those soldiers in an assault unit, and there's no limit to what they might be willing to pay in order to avoid the meat grinder. But if they seem as if they'll cause trouble, then the meat grinder is right there for their commanders to use. Those incentives also help explain increasing reports of physical torture of Russian soldiers by their own commanders on or near the front lines, including soldiers who've already been wounded. Our own Power Doctrine team has encountered footage of Russian troops who've had multiple limbs amputated due to combat wounds who were then clinging wrapped onto trees and extorted further. Videos like that can be sent to a soldier's family, who will then end up paying even more to spare the life of a person who's locked into conscription or contract by the Russian state. Quoting researcher Alexandra Arpova, who was speaking to PBS about communications from Russian families, in many cases, in many letters, the people are saying that literally we paid everything to have our father, brother, husband not to be killed. In many cases, superiors, they use torture to take money from the soldiers. As for the scale of the brutality, we can't know for sure, but judging by the available information, this kind of treatment is everywhere. One Russian exile outlet, Radio Echo, obtained accounts from soldiers like these, and over a 6-month period in 2025, Radio Echo indicated that they had received almost 12,000 complaints of corruption and violence by Russian commanders against their own men. It's here that we find the real root of Russia's ongoing military incompetence, where Ukraine has spent the last 4 years learning, adapting, and innovating on the battlefield. Russian generals, defense industrial elites, and low-level battlefield commanders have been building a deeply corrupt machine at every level of the Russian armed forces. That machine exists to extract wealth for the direct and personal benefit of people lucky enough to wield power, at the expense of frontline soldiers who aren't so fortunate. In a system like that, where officials aren't just personally corrupt, but can safely assume that corruption is all around them, reform just isn't a goal even if it saves lives. Reform there is a danger, even an enemy, because if Russia were to ever fix the incompetence that runs through its armed forces, then it would destroy the machine that Russian incompetence is built to serve. Right now, that status quo demands constant reports of forward progress by any means necessary, and the Kremlin is willing to pay every ruble in Russia in order to make that happen. But Vladimir Putin's military is overrun with people who don't particularly care about conquering Ukraine, as long as they know they'll be set for life in the post-war Russia that comes next. Russian incompetence is getting worse because it's becoming streamlined, and because the Russian leadership has proved that corruption will go unchecked as long as forward progress continues. The incompetence is the point, because the longer this situation lasts, the longer this vast corrupt machine can go on making a profit. That was depressing.